Hello, welcome to the A Book a Day channel. The book we're going to interpret for you in this issue is Do You Talk Funny? First of all, I must confess that I approach this book with a learning attitude. I have always felt that humor is something innate, and for someone like me with little sense of humor, it seemed hopeless. If you share the sentiment, then this book is definitely a godsend. It will tell you that humor is a skill that can be trained, and by learning the methods in the book, you too can become an engaging speaker. This might sound confusing, but what the author is talking about is not how to be funny and entertaining in everyday life, but how to use humor techniques to make your speeches more engaging in specific situations, such as public speaking. The author of this book, David Nihill, is a stand-up comedian. You probably can't imagine that David used to be someone who got extremely nervous and wished to disappear when speaking on stage, suffering from a fear of public speaking. He had 3 significant opportunities in his life, and his fear of public speaking ruined them all. Later, through a series of coincidences, he forced himself to engage in a year of humor practice, and miraculously became a stand-up comedy pro, even covered by publications like the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. He also founded a humor research society dedicated to helping others develop their ability to speak in an engaging way. David drew a lesson from his own experiences. Humor can help you overcome fear and improve the effectiveness of your speeches. For ordinary people, the best way to train a sense of humor in speaking is to learn from stand-up comedy. David discovered that many successful speakers use a similar style of humor to stand-up comedy. Therefore, he distilled 7 highly effective principles, based on the classic theories of stand-up comedy, and his practical experience, which he shares with you in this book. I've divided these principles into 2 parts, preparation off-stage and performance on stage. In this interpretation, I'll first discuss the author's views on these 2 parts. However, after reading this book, I had a question of my own. While all 7 of David's principles make sense, apart from the second one, the rest don't seem to have much to do with being interesting. With this question in mind, I consulted other teachers who have a deep understanding of humor. They explained that my confusion arose because I didn't fully grasp the concept of humor. So in the third part, I'll provide some additional insights and share what the teacher thinks about humor. Part 1. Alright, let's move on to the first part. When it comes to humor, many people might first think of some witty one-liners. The British writer and king of one-liners, Oscar Wilde, was known for his humorous take on marriage, like, "What is the main reason for divorce? Marriage." However, if you suddenly told this line to a colleague without context, would they laugh? Probably not. This is what the author David wants to convey as the first principle: incorporate humor into stories. He says that the laughter he receives on stage often comes from real-life stories rather than carefully crafted witticisms. Storytelling guru Robert McKee believes that stories are a creative transformation of life. An engaging story creatively transforms life through humor. Let me give you an example. I once heard a speech on the topic of emotional management. The speaker wanted to convey a message. In the past, we had a misconception that physical injuries were considered illnesses, while psychological injuries were seen as weaknesses. So we didn't pay much attention to mental health. However, he didn't directly state this message. Instead, he wrapped it within a story. He said, "I grew up with my twin brother. As twins, you quickly become an expert on one thing: noticing favoritism. Even if my brother's cookie was just slightly larger than mine, I would question it." Then he added, "Of course, my parents never let me go hungry." At this point, the audience burst into laughter. He went on to explain that the story was used to illustrate another form of favoritism, emphasizing physical health over mental health. You might argue that this opening wasn't necessary, but by wrapping the message in a real story, it had at least 2 benefits. It allowed the audience to get to know him as a person, and made the core issue he wanted to address, the undervaluation of mental health, more relatable. After the laughter, the audience was more likely to resonate with the message. You might say that sharing a personal story doesn't always guarantee humor. That's correct. Not all stories are inherently funny. To make a story engaging, you need to apply the second principle that David tells us. Humor requires skill. The skill involves 2 steps: finding a funny story and making the story funnier. How do you find a funny story? A person doing everything right is not usually funny, right? Misfortunes and setbacks are more likely to become your treasure trove. Here's a formula for evaluating good material. Humor equals tragedy x time. Someone once asked a stand-up comedian, "Do you just turn the misfortunes in your life into jokes?" His response was, "Not yet, but I will." Tragic or unfortunate events need time to ferment. You need to be able to look at them with a detached, ironic, self-deprecating perspective to turn them into humor. Unpleasant things happen in life, and after you've gotten angry or upset, don't forget to jot them down someday. They could become material for your speeches. What you should do next is to make the story you've chosen funnier based on the needs of your speech. Now, let me give you the second classic formula. Punchline equals setup plus specific humor. Setting up the punchline doesn't mean abruptly throwing out the joke. That won't be funny. Instead, you should surprise the audience with the punchline, which requires you to shatter the interest and expectations you've intentionally built up. So you need to generate interest and expectations in the audience through setup. Combining this with specific humor is a skill that needs practice. Let me give you an example. There's a famous stand-up comedy routine called Just Kidding. It lasts a little over 3 minutes, and if you recall, the first 2 minutes don't have any apparent humor. The comedian starts by explaining the background. A mother in her 30s is hanging laundry outside and needs to go inside to cook dinner. She's worried about thieves stealing her clothes, so she asks her 5-year-old son Tom to watch. Then, a thief approaches Tom and strikes up a conversation saying, "Hey kid, let's play together." "I'm just kidding," he makes Tom repeat his name several times. At this point, the setup is almost complete, and the audience's interest has reached its peak. What the comedian does next is deliver the punchline. The thief takes off his pants, and the child rushes inside, shouting, "Mom, he took my pants." The mother asks, "Who?" The child replies, "Just kidding." The audience bursts into laughter. As you can see, those 2 words, "just kidding," had a huge impact and made everyone laugh because the setup was well done. From setup to punchline, there's a critical element in between, which is suspense. If it's not a live performance, it's challenging to directly experience the feeling of suspense. So, David provides an extreme example in his book. The former president of Kimberly-Clark, the parent company of Huggies diapers, Darwin Smith, had to give a speech to the company's employees. His opening line was, "Okay, let's all stand for a moment of silence." As an audience member, you'd likely be puzzled, wondering if someone had passed away. After a few minutes of silence, Smith solemnly said, "We just had a moment of silence for Procter & Gamble." The audience was immediately taken aback because Procter & Gamble is a well-known global consumer goods company and a competitor of Kimberly-Clark. The moment of silence was a setup, and during that time, the confused audience was curious about why they were observing a moment of silence and for whom. This feeling of suspense is essential. It's like riding a roller coaster. You slowly reach the peak, pause for a moment, and then, bam, deliver the punchline, and the laughter follows. David says creating suspense isn't that difficult, and in a speech, it's generally achieved with a brief pause. Remember, the basic structure of a joke is setup plus punchline. Reflect on those jokes that you found funny. They likely follow this structure. You can use more advanced techniques to make your jokes a thread throughout your speech. These are called continuous punchlines, where you build on your initial story, using reversals and other techniques to keep the audience surprised and delighted. Humor in a speech is not a result of spontaneous wit. It's a deliberate effect. Many people, like me, may have a similar misunderstanding, thinking that humor is innate. But many stage and screen comedians, such as Stephen Chow and Guo Dagang, are said to be rather introverted in their personal lives, appearing as if they're entirely different people. David says the truth is that there aren't many naturally funny people among stand-up comedians. The skill of humor requires practice, and of all the forms of practice, writing it down is the most important. This is the third principle of offstage preparation: humor is written. The most significant difference between stand-up comedy and regular speaking is that you need to consider not only what to say, but also how to say it. Writing is a means to simulate this process. How do you simulate it? When you're writing, you should be very aware that you're writing lines, not a narrative. You're going to perform this dialogue on stage in the future. You are a character in the play, and the live speech is the scene of the drama. You should connect yourself as much as possible to the live audience, anticipate their feelings, and predict their reactions. David provides many specific suggestions here, such as connecting to hot topics that the audience cares about. His own common approach is to introduce himself as an Irishman. He foresaw that the audience might be curious about his accent, so he addressed their curiosity directly. This has become his signature, and in the world of stand-up comedy, he's known as Dave from Ireland. 1 minute on stage requires 10 years of preparation off stage. To make a career out of stand-up comedy, one needs at least 7 years of diligent practice, with each minute of performance demanding 22 hours of preparation. So, before going on stage, make sure you're well prepared. Remember the 3 principles we discussed earlier? Humor in stories, humor requires skill, and humor is written. Part 2. Alright, you've put in the groundwork, and now it's time to face the final challenge, giving your speech. In the second part, we will discuss the principles you should remember for your 1-minute moment on stage. Before stepping onto the stage, you need to do one more thing, which is rehearsing. This is David's 4th principle: humor requires rehearsing. Rehearsing not only helps refine your jokes to make them funnier, but it also boosts your confidence. It addresses two common issues in live speeches: forgetting your lines and stage fright. The ways to deal with these are mental rehearsal and real-time rehearsal. You might have experienced the frustration of forgetting your lines even though you were well prepared. To overcome this, remember David's practical tip, the memory palace technique. In simple terms, it involves mentally rehearsing your speech. Imagine the process of your speech as entering a house. As soon as you step through the front door, your speech begins. As you move through the hallway, you deliver your first joke. When you reach the living room, you present your first point. Treat each room as a critical checkpoint where you store your key points and jokes. When you step on stage, all you need to do is mentally walk through the path you've already traveled numerous times in your mind. This method ensures you won't forget your lines. I personally tried it during a department meeting and can attest to its effectiveness. I didn't need any notes and delivered a smooth report. However, forgetting lines is not the most daunting aspect of public speaking. The biggest obstacle to overcome is stage fright. You might relate to the feeling of anxiety, stuttering, and trembling when speaking in public. Going on stage can be genuinely terrifying. For me, the most valuable lesson from this book was understanding that since stage fright is a physiological response, the best approach is to accept it. Acknowledge that these physiological reactions are inevitable and entirely normal. The trick is to take a few deep breaths before going on stage, or wear dark-colored clothing to hide any sweat stains. While this doesn't eliminate stage fright entirely, it helps manage it. If you want to fully overcome stage fright, be prepared. Be ready for all possible scenarios through real-time rehearsals. This aligns with the classic 5P principle: proper planning prevents poor performance. If you still experience stage fright, it means your preparation wasn't sufficient. The ideal place for rehearsing is, of course, the actual stage where you will give your speech. However, rehearsing repeatedly on the actual stage might not always be feasible. David also offers an alternative method called the bar test, to put it bluntly. This means grabbing any opportunity to speak publicly, delivering your jokes, and gauging the audience's reactions. Now, you are thoroughly prepared and ready to take the stage. Before you do, David provides 2 emergency kits for you. One for handling unforeseen situations, and one for controlling the audience. These are the 5th and 6th principles. No matter how well prepared you are, the live environment is filled with the unknown and the unpredictable. This is both the scary and fascinating aspect of live performances. To reduce fear and embrace the joy of the unknown, remember this: acknowledge that you are in the moment. Don't dismiss this as a mere platitude. You can use it as a mantra to help you switch from your everyday state to a performance state. This concept is supported by comedy theory. In the comedy world, acknowledging the obvious is called addressing the room. By acknowledging that you are in the moment, you should be in tune with the audience, sense what they might want to hear, and understand what's happening in the room. You can even directly voice these observations. This way, your speech becomes a form of communication. Speech is not about talking to yourself. Its success depends on the audience's reactions. Therefore, you also need to control the audience. A live environment is quite remarkable. The audience members often don't know each other. Yet when they enter the venue, they seem to transform into a single entity. Think about the collective laughter you hear at a comedy show. This phenomenon is a result of audience synchronization. It's quite fascinating. To control the audience, you must bring all the audience members into the zone you set. When you intend to play, the lights dim as soon as it begins, naturally focusing your attention on the stage. The lighting indicates that it's time to watch the performance. When everyone's attention converges at one point, the zone is established. In stand-up comedy or public speaking, you might not have the luxury of adjusting lighting, so David suggests a simple method. He tells everyone, "If you can hear me, please clap." The synchronized applause focuses the audience's attention, creating the desired zone. Building the zone is crucial for the success of your speech. Therefore, warming up the audience is essential. David emphasizes that within the first 30 seconds of your speech, you should quickly grab the audience's attention, introduce yourself, explain why they should listen to you, and make them like you. The effectiveness of your warm-up can significantly affect your speech. David once performed the same routine 2 nights in a row with drastically different results. The difference was that he botched the first 30 seconds on the night with the less effective performance. Now you are ready to perform. David provides many specific suggestions, such as controlling your voice and choosing the right position on the stage. Here, I won't list them all, but I'll remind you of one thing. Always conclude your speech with a summary, not in a question and answer format. Ending with a summary ensures that the audience leaves with a clear understanding of your message. Finally, there's one last principle: always fine-tune. Many comedians repeatedly listen to recordings of their own shows. Initially, They may feel uncomfortable hearing their own voices, but they need to overcome this. David explains that professionals not only review but re-review their performances. To overcome the embarrassment, you must detach yourself and become an evaluator. Professional stand-up comedians assess each of their performances, often using a scoring system. For example, they might award themselves 5 points for making the entire audience laugh and applaud. They then use these scores to fine-tune their scripts, delivery, and various aspects of their performances. Remember that all the humorous content you see, whether in movies, advertisements, or stand-up comedy, has gone through repeated fine-tuning, often involving significant structural adjustments. Part 3. At the beginning, I mentioned that I had a puzzling question about David's 7 principles. Apart from the second one, several of them don't seem directly related to becoming an interesting person. To address this, I interviewed a teacher who had a deep understanding of humor. His response was enlightening. He explained that our misunderstanding might stem from misconceptions about what being interesting entails. We often associate interesting with being funny. In reality, being interesting is a multifaceted trait, and it's about the overall impression you leave on others. You might have experienced a situation at a gathering where something had everyone in stitches, but when you try to convey that experience to others, they don't seem to get the humor. Don't be discouraged. This is not solely an issue of your communication skills. The punchline is like salt. If it's not sprinkled on the story, it's just a bland taste. The teacher mentioned that in this book, being interesting is essentially synonymous with humor, while humor is just one form of expression of being interesting. Humor has an entire field supporting it called comedy, and stand-up comedy is a branch of that field. This is similar to learning to swim. Stand-up comedy is like one style of swimming, such as butterfly stroke. Swimming also has breaststroke, freestyle, and more, which is akin to different forms of comedy, including silent comedy and clowning. Each has its own unique way of expression. Purely being funny without a system is akin to doggy paddling. It's not a professional swimming style, and it lacks theoretical underpinning. So the teacher's perspective aligns well with David, as they both believe that humor can be learned, and being funny has techniques and even formulas. However, I still had some concerns. Is mastering humor just a matter of learning 1 or 2 formulas? The teacher pointed out that humor is not merely an expressive skill. It's a way of thinking. I had this confusion because I had been viewing humor solely as a set of expressive skills, primarily focusing on the formulas. In reality, it's the mindset behind it that matters most. This book leans toward skill building, which of course is not comprehensive. So, what exactly is the mindset of humor? It involves viewing your life with a unique and amusing perspective, seeing the truth, recognizing the pain, and finding the absurdity in reality. Wittgenstein said that jokes are notes on the clarifications of situations. True humor comes from insights. Someone with more insights is undoubtedly an interesting person. So if you can remember just one thing after reading this book, it shouldn't be about punchlines being equal to setup plus punch, but rather that humor equals tragedy multiplied by time. After all, once the distressing events have passed, they become laughable. Why do speeches need humor? David explains that this is due to the nature of the human brain, as the brain naturally gravitates towards what's interesting. If we think more deeply, this is because humor is inherent to human nature. Alright, let's summarize. The author, David, is a stand-up comedian who shares his transformation from having a fear of public speaking to becoming a stand-up comedy expert. This book initially instills confidence in you. Talent is rare and unpredictable, while experience is a treasure accessible to everyone. Through training, you too can become an engaging speaker like him. This book discusses 7 principles for making speeches more interesting, and here's a quick review. Preparation offstage involves 3 points: humor and storytelling, the need for humor skills, and humor being something you write. On-stage performance has 3 aspects: the necessity of rehearsing humor, addressing the live situation, and managing the audience. Lastly, never forget to fine-tune your performance. Towards the end of the book, David lists 80 tips, covering almost all the training he's undergone, making this book practical and sincere. However, remember that knowledge and skills are different. Just like learning to swim, even if you've understood all the knowledge about swimming, if you haven't actually been in the water, it's of no use. So as a final exercise, use the techniques you've learned in this episode to share an interesting story about yourself with others. This concludes the essence of this book. If you found it valuable, feel free to share this video with your friends. Congratulations, you have finished another book.